My mom funded my sister's luxury life with my money, then tried to hijack my wedding, so I made her regret it. And Theni. Growing up, I always knew I was the afterthought in my own family. My mother, Catherine, never hid the fact that my younger sister, Madeline, was her pride and joy while I was just there. If Madeline so much as sneezed, Catherine acted like she had cured a deadly disease. Meanwhile, I could bring home straight A's, win academic competitions, or work my ass off, and it wouldn't even register. Everything revolved around Madeline. She got the newest clothes, the biggest birthday parties, and the most extravagant Christmas presents. If she wanted something, she got it. If I wanted something, I was being selfish. It wasn't just about money. If I needed help with schoolwork, I was told to be more independent, to figure it out myself. But if Madeline needed help, Catherine would drop everything and practically do the work for her. It became obvious to me by the time I was a teenager. Madeline got to be the princess, and I got to be the worker. So, at 16, I did what any desperate, overlooked teenager would do. I got a part-time job, hoping to save money for college and maybe even afford a little bit of freedom. Big mistake. The moment I started earning my own money, Catherine demanded I hand over my paychecks for the household. Funny how those household expenses included Madeline's brand new phone, designer shoes, and expensive salon trips. But if I dared to ask for even a fraction of my earnings to buy something for myself, suddenly, we were struggling. If I questioned anything, I was ungrateful. If I complained, I was disrespectful. If I refused to hand over my paycheck, I was accused of not caring about my family. And when I pushed back too hard, Catherine would make a public scene, sobbing to relatives about how I was breaking her heart. The worst part? People believed her. They saw a hard-working single mother doing her best, not the woman who stole from her own daughter to fund her favorite child's lifestyle. By the time I turned 18, I knew I had to get out. I threw myself into my studies, determined to escape, and when I earned a full-ride scholarship, I thought I had finally won. When I told Catherine the news, I naively expected a flicker of pride. Instead, she called me selfish. She accused me of abandoning the family and acting like she was a bad mother. That was the last conversation we had before I left for college. I should have known she wouldn't let me go so easily. Even after I moved out, she found ways to keep tabs on me, manipulating family members into giving her updates. That's how she found out about my engagement before I even had a chance to announce it myself. Meanwhile, Madeline never left home. She had no reason to. Catherine funded her entire life, maxing out credit cards and borrowing money from relatives just to maintain Madeline's lifestyle. She had never worked a day in her life and had no concept of responsibility. While I was out there grinding, working my way up in my career, she was still living like a spoiled teenager well into her 20s. For years, I kept my distance. No holidays, no family drama. I built a career, made my own money, and found something Catherine could never take from me: stability. And for a while, I thought I was free. But the moment I got engaged, Catherine suddenly decided she wanted to be my mother again. At first, it was small things, asking about wedding plans, acting interested in my life, but it didn't take long for the demands to start rolling in. Madeline was to be my maid of honor. Not a request, a demand. Catherine would be handling the guest list, the venue, the catering, because mothers plan weddings. Oh, and of course, I would be footing the bill for everything, including Madeline's designer dress and a lavish thank you gift for Catherine herself. I shut it down immediately. No, Madeline would not be my maid of honor. No, Catherine would not be running my wedding. And no, I was not paying for their ridiculous demands. Catherine lost it. She screamed about how I was heartless, how family comes first, and how she had sacrificed everything for me. Madeline, ever the victim, started crying about how I was excluding her and ruining our bond. Then the relatives started calling, telling me I should reconsider, that Catherine had always done her best. The final straw came when Catherine showed up at my workplace, causing a scene in the parking lot, wailing about how I was betraying my family. Security had to escort her off the premises. And that's when it hit me. They didn't love me. They never had. I was just a resource, something to be controlled, manipulated, and used. And now that I had a life of my own, now that I was out of their reach, they were panicking. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't just going to walk away. I was going to make sure Catherine finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. After the disaster at my workplace, Catherine went silent for a few days. No calls, no messages, nothing. But I knew better than to believe she had given up. She wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was waiting for me to panic, to come crawling back like I had so many times before. But this time, I had a different plan. I sent her a text, short and to the point. I told her I didn't want to fight anymore, that I hated how things had turned out, and that I wanted to talk, just the two of us, to find some middle ground. I even threw in a line about how family should come first. She took the bait immediately. Within minutes, she responded, her tone smug and condescending, as if I had finally come to my senses. She agreed. But of course, she dictated the time and place, some high-end restaurant she loved to show off at. Typical Catherine move. She wanted me on her turf, somewhere she could feel in control. I let her think she was winning. The night of the dinner, I played my part perfectly. I walked in looking drained, like I was ready to fold. And sure enough, Catherine was already seated, sipping a glass of wine with that triumphant little smile she always had when she thought she had outmaneuvered me. The moment I sat down, she launched into a speech about how she had been waiting for me to come to my senses, how she always knew I'd regret pushing her away, how all she ever wanted was what was best for me. She made sure to slip in plenty of jabs, how difficult I had always been, how Madeline never caused her these kinds of headaches, how a mother's love was unconditional even when her own daughter made horrible decisions. I sat there, nodding at the right moments, playing the role of the remorseful, defeated daughter she wanted me to be. Then I steered the conversation toward money. Casually, like it was an afterthought, I brought up how I had been struggling with unexpected wedding costs. I hesitated, looking down like I was embarrassed, then let it slip that I might need to take out a loan, that things were tight, that I wasn't sure how I was going to make everything work. Catherine's expression shifted in an instant. Suddenly, she was interested. She leaned in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy, and started talking about how finances had always been difficult for me because I never accepted her guidance. Then she dropped a casual bomb, how Madeline had never had to struggle because she had made better choices. And I knew exactly what that meant. Madeline had never struggled because Catherine had funded her entire life. Her rent, her car, her shopping sprees, her vacations. Everything. I let her keep talking, let her ramble about how easy Madeline had it, how she never had to worry about money, while I had been out in the real world, working multiple jobs in college, budgeting every dollar, scraping by just to survive. Catherine didn't see the irony, didn't see how every word she spoke only confirmed what I had always known. She had never cared about me, only about keeping Madeline comfortable. I sighed, hesitating just long enough to make it look real, then asked for help. Not much, just a small loan to cover some unexpected costs. $15,000. I promised I'd pay her back, of course. I just needed a little breathing room. Catherine barely contained her excitement. She let me squirm for a minute, pretending to think it over, then laid out her terms. She'd be happy to help, on the condition that I did things her way. Madeline would be my maid of honor. Catherine would handle the guest list. She would have a say in the venue. And then, in the most blatant attempt to reassert control, she hinted that I should consider moving back home so we could rebuild our relationship. I hesitated again, looking trapped, looking like I had no choice but to agree. Catherine left that dinner convinced she had won. For the next week, I let her believe it. I went silent, made her think I was struggling, that I was waiting for her help. Then, just when she was likely feeling her most powerful, I sent a message full of gratitude, thanking her for being such a supportive mother, saying I didn't know what I would do without her. That was all she needed. She started checking in constantly, sending reminders of what I owed her now that she was helping me, dropping hints about how this was a turning point for us. She thought she had me back under her thumb. Then I started pulling away. I took longer to respond, sent vague messages, didn't acknowledge her demands. When she called, I let it go to voicemail. It didn't take long for her patience to crack. The texts started getting more aggressive. First, the guilt tripping, how I was disrespecting her generosity. Then the anger, demanding that I respond immediately. Finally, the threats, how she would have to reconsider helping me if I didn't start showing some appreciation. That was when I sent the final message. I never took anything from you, Mom. I just wanted you to feel what it's like to believe you have something, only to realize you never did. Her response was immediate. First, the outrage. Furious calls and angry texts demanding to know how I could betray her. Then the victim act, long-winded messages about how she had only ever tried to be a good mother. And finally, the threats, veiled warnings that I would regret treating her this way. I ignored every single one. For the first time in her life, Catherine wasn't in control. And she knew it. When Catherine realized I wasn't responding, she did what she always did. She escalated. The calls didn't stop, one after another, her name flashing across my screen in all caps. The voicemails started out furious, accusing me of being ungrateful, heartless, a terrible daughter. But when those didn't work, the tone shifted. Suddenly, she was the victim, rambling about how she had sacrificed everything for me, about how she just wanted her family back together. And when that didn't work, she circled back to threats, warning me that I would regret treating her like this. I ignored every single one. When she realized I wasn't going to give in, she turned to the next best thing, extended family. By the next day, my inbox was flooded with messages from aunts, uncles, and distant cousins, some concerned, some outright hostile. The more reasonable ones asked if everything was okay between me and my mother. The others? They parroted Catherine's words like a script, accusing me of using my own mother, of taking advantage of her kindness, of stabbing her in the back. That was when I knew she had flipped the script. In her version of events, I had come crawling back to her, desperate for money, and she, being the ever-forgiving mother, had agreed to help me, only for me to turn around and betray her. Some people believed her, but not everyone. A few relatives, ones who had seen through Catherine's act over the years, started reaching out privately. They weren't buying it. Some even apologized, saying they should have spoken up sooner about how she treated me growing up. It was strange, hearing people acknowledge something I had been screaming into the void for years. But I didn't let it pull me back in. I had spent my whole life fighting for validation from people who had never bothered to see the truth. I wasn't about to start now. And then, just as I expected, Madeline finally entered the scene. Her first message was short, just a single line about how I was tearing the family apart. I didn't respond. A few hours later, she sent another. Then another. Each one getting longer, more desperate. She guilt-tripped. She emotionally manipulated. She threw dramatic statements about how she had never seen Mom like this before, how I needed to fix things before it was too late. But I knew the real reason she was panicking. Without me to absorb Catherine's wrath, Madeline was taking the full force of it for the first time in her life. For years, she had been shielded, protected, coddled while I was the one carrying the weight of Catherine's expectations. Now that I was gone, she was experiencing, for the first time, what it was like to disappoint Catherine. And she couldn't handle it. At first, she tried turning to some of our more distant relatives for support, but even the ones who had sided with Catherine in the past were hesitant to bankroll her lifestyle. I started hearing whispers through the family that Catherine was putting pressure on her, pushing her to do more, to take on responsibilities that had never been expected of her before. Madeline, who had spent her whole life being handed everything, was suddenly expected to pull her own weight. Meanwhile, I was making other plans. Nathan and I decided to keep our wedding location a secret, telling only a select group of trusted friends and family. We didn't post anything online. We didn't include the details on the invitations. Everything was locked down tight. But someone must have slipped, either by accident or under pressure, because somehow, Catherine and Madeline found out. I got the confirmation 2 weeks before the wedding, when a cousin, one of the few who had been on my side, texted me a warning. Catherine knows. She's been making calls. I didn't panic. I had expected something like this. So I did what Catherine never would have predicted. I set up security. I made sure the venue staff knew my mother and sister by name, that they were not to be let in under any circumstances. I even put a rule in place. Anyone who tried to involve them in the wedding in any way would be uninvited. I wasn't taking any chances. That was the last straw. The moment Catherine realized she was being completely cut out, she lost it. She spent the next week frantically calling relatives, ranting about my disrespect, about how I was letting Nathan brainwash me into shutting out my own mother. She showed up at my aunt's house, sobbing about how I had abandoned her, demanding to know who had told me she found out. Then she took it online, posting vague, passive-aggressive messages about how heartbreaking it was when children turned on the ones who raised them. I ignored it all. Then, just days before the wedding, She made one last desperate attempt. I woke up to find myself added to a group chat, one I hadn't joined willingly. Catherine and Madeline had created it, dragging in every flying monkey they could find. The messages were already flooding in, walls of text filled with emotional blackmail. Catherine alternating between rage and forced sweetness. One message blaming me for destroying the family, the next acting like she was just a concerned mother who wanted to talk. Madeline chiming in, saying I was being cruel, that I was hurting Mom, that this had gone too far. Then came the others, the enablers, the ones who fed off the drama. Some guilt-tripped me, saying Catherine was in a crisis and needed me. Others outright demanded I stop this nonsense and let my mother be part of my wedding. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I sent one message. She mistreated me for years. If she's struggling now, that's on her. Then I left the group and blocked the number. Madeline, though, wasn't done. A few hours later, another message came, this time from her personal number. She wasn't playing the golden child anymore. She wasn't smug, wasn't condescending. Now she was begging. She said she couldn't handle Mom alone, that she was exhausted, that she didn't know what to do. I replied once, "You were fine benefiting from my suffering. Now you get to deal with her." No more messages came after that. At that moment, I knew Catherine wasn't done. She had one last move left. She was going to try to crash my wedding, and I was ready for her. The moment I saw the security guard approaching, I knew. I had been expecting this, bracing for it, and yet there was still a small part of me that hoped. Just for once, Catherine wouldn't make a scene. But I knew better. "They're here," the guard said, his voice low. He didn't have to say who. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let her ruin this day. "Are they making a scene yet?" "Not yet," he said. "But they're trying to push their way in. Your mother is insisting she was invited." Of course she was. Catherine had spent her entire life bending reality to fit whatever version of the truth suited her best. Nathan appeared at my side, his hand already on my back before I could say anything. "I'll handle it." "No," I said immediately, shaking my head. "This is my fight." He studied me for a moment, his jaw tight, before nodding. "I'm coming with you." Together, we made our way toward the entrance, the murmurs of guests filling the space around us. Word was already spreading, people whispering, glancing toward the front doors. By the time we stepped outside, a small group had gathered, watching from a distance. And there she was, standing in front of the venue like she belonged there, her hands gripping the front of her ridiculous gown, her face twisted into an expression of righteous indignation. Madeline was next to her, arms crossed, looking just as entitled as ever. The second Catherine spotted me, her expression morphed into something dramatic, something carefully calculated. She took a step forward, her voice ringing through the air. "Oh, honey, there you are?" I knew this was a misunderstanding. "Tell them to let us in." I stared at her, my blood cold. "There's no misunderstanding. You weren't invited." The moment the words left my mouth, Catherine's entire body tensed. A flicker of something ugly passed through her eyes, but she forced out a trembling breath, shaking her head. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing to the growing audience. "I'm your mother. I have a right to be here." "No, you don't." I folded my arms, standing my ground. "And you know that. You knew from the beginning. You just didn't think the rules applied to you." Madeline scoffed, shifting her weight. "You're being ridiculous. You're embarrassing yourself in front of everyone." I almost laughed. "I'm embarrassing myself?" I gestured around us, at the security, the watching guests, the tension thick in the air. "You showed up uninvited, tried to force your way in, and now you're making a public scene because you didn't get your way. Do you have any idea how pathetic this looks?" Catherine's jaw clenched, her mask of concern slipping for just a second before she schooled her expression into something softer, more wounded. "Sweetheart, please," she whispered. "This isn't you. He's turning you against your family." And there it was. The final, desperate attempt to blame Nathan. I felt his hand tighten against my back, his patience wearing thin, but I was done playing this game. I took a step forward, my voice quiet but sharp. "You've spent my entire life controlling me, but you don't get to do that anymore. You are not welcome here. You are not a part of this day." The watching guests were silent now, every pair of eyes locked on us. Catherine's breathing was uneven, her face red, her hands shaking, not with sadness, but with rage. I had never seen her like this before, Never seen her lose control so publicly. And then, just like that, she snapped. Her voice exploded, sharp and furious. "You think this marriage means anything without me?" she screamed, her composure completely gone. "I am your mother. This wedding is a joke without my blessing. You'll regret this." I heard gasps from the crowd. I saw people pulling out their phones. Someone was recording. Security was already stepping in, their hands raised in warning. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you to leave." "I'm not going anywhere," she shrieked, her voice cracking. And that was when the police car pulled up. The day of the wedding arrived, and I should have been nervous, but instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Everything was exactly as I wanted it to be. No unnecessary drama, no walking on eggshells, just love and excitement. The venue was breathtaking, set up just the way Nathan and I had envisioned. His family welcomed me with open arms, treating me like I had always belonged. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a family that truly cared about me, not out of obligation, not because they had something to gain, but simply because they loved me for who I was. I had taken every precaution. The guest list was tightly controlled, security was stationed at every entrance, and I had made it crystal clear. If anyone tried to involve Catherine or Madeline, they would be uninvited on the spot. Most people respected that, though a few had tried to subtly ask if I was sure I really wanted to keep my own mother out of my wedding. I didn't budge. Catherine had spent my entire life controlling me, manipulating me, using me, and this wedding? This was mine. She had no place here. An hour before the ceremony, just as I was finishing my final touches in the bridal suite, security knocked on the door. 2 uninvited guests had arrived. My heart didn't even skip a beat. I had expected this. It was almost funny how predictable she was. I walked over to the window, peeking through the curtains to see the entrance below. And there they were. Catherine and Madeline stood at the main doors, dressed as if they belonged there, as if they had been invited guests instead of 2 people who had no right to be anywhere near my wedding. Catherine, ever the dramatist, had gone all out. She was in a floor-length gown, something so flashy it looked like she was the mother of the bride. And Madeline, she had opted for a white dress. Of course she had. They didn't even try to be subtle. Catherine immediately started demanding entry, her voice loud enough that I could hear her through the glass. She told security that she had a right to be there, that no one could keep a mother from her own daughter's wedding. When security didn't budge, she switched tactics, her voice breaking as she put on her best grieving mother act, rambling about how I had been manipulated into shutting her out, how she just wanted to see me walk down the aisle. When that failed, Madeline stepped forward, her arms crossed, her face twisted into an indignant pout as she whined about how unfair this was, about how I was ruining the family over something so small. Security refused to let them in. The commotion had drawn attention. Guests were starting to gather near the entrance, murmuring, watching the scene unfold. That was when Catherine lost whatever composure she had left. She snapped. Her voice rose, shrill and desperate, as she turned from manipulation to full-blown rage. She started yelling about how Nathan had stolen me, how I had been brainwashed into hating my family. She ranted about how she had given me everything, how this was how I repaid her. And then, in the ultimate act of desperation, she screamed that this wedding wasn't even legitimate without her there, that without her blessing, it didn't count. I should have been angry. I should have felt humiliated. But watching it unfold from the window above, I felt nothing but satisfaction. She was making a fool of herself, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The venue staff had seen enough. Someone had already called the police. Madeline realized what was happening first. Her head snapped toward Catherine, her posture going stiff. I knew that look. It was the moment she realized that for the first time in her life, her mother wasn't winning. The people around them weren't comforting Catherine, they weren't siding with her. They were watching her, whispering, recording. That was the thing Catherine had never understood. Her manipulations worked behind closed doors, where she could twist the narrative, cry to relatives who only ever got her side of the story. But out in the open, with an audience, she had no power. When the police arrived, they were given 2 choices: leave willingly or be escorted out. Catherine stood frozen, like she couldn't believe this was actually happening. I could see it in her face, the calculations, the realization that there was no way to turn this around. If she fought, she would be physically removed. If she left, she would be admitting defeat. For For the first time in her life, she had no winning move. Madeline must have sensed it too, because she grabbed Catherine's arm and yanked her back, hissing something under her breath. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was saying. We have to go? We've already lost. And just like that, they left. Humiliated, defeated, exposed. And I went back inside, fixed my veil, and walked down the aisle. The ceremony was perfect. There wasn't a trace of Catherine, not a single shadow of her presence to taint the day. I said my vows to Nathan, laughed, danced, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing but pure happiness. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, one of my cousins pulled me aside, barely containing his grin. He held up his phone and asked, "Do you want to see something hilarious?" The video had already made its way through the family. Someone had recorded the entire meltdown. Catherine's screaming, Madeline's whining, the way the police had forced them to leave. It had been shared in the family group chats, sent from relative to relative. And the best part? No one was defending her. Oh, sure, a few of the usual enablers had tried to make excuses. She was just emotional. She didn't mean any harm, but most people? They were finally seeing her for who she really was. Catherine had spent her whole life carefully curating an image, making sure she was seen as the devoted mother, the misunderstood victim, the woman who had only ever wanted what was best for her daughters. But now everyone had seen the truth. And Madeline, the golden child, the one who had always been praised, defended, spoiled, she was nothing more than Catherine's accomplice in humiliation. I made one final move that night. I deleted every lingering connection to them. No more explaining myself. No more guilt. No more wondering if maybe, one day, they would change. Just peace. And to make things even better, Nathan had planned one last surprise. Tickets to our dream honeymoon. It wasn't just a vacation. It was the beginning of a life where Catherine no longer existed. In the days after the wedding, I kept expecting some sort of final explosion from Catherine. One last desperate attempt to regain control. But there was only silence. It was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I knew better than to believe she had given up, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what she would do next. She had already lost. Nathan and I left for our honeymoon the day after the wedding. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail: private beaches, candlelit dinners, long walks under the stars. For the first time in my life, I could truly relax. There were no unexpected calls, no guilt-tripping messages, no carefully orchestrated manipulations lurking in the background. Catherine had spent my entire life keeping me in a constant state of anxiety, always forcing me to anticipate her next move, her next demand, her next meltdown. And now, she was nothing more than a bad memory. But, of course, she wasn't done. 3 days into our honeymoon, I got a message from a relative. "You need to see this." Attached was a screenshot of one of Catherine's latest social media posts. I did everything for my daughter. I sacrificed. I loved. I gave her the world. And how does she repay me? By cutting me out of her life on the most important day? By humiliating me in front of family? By turning everyone against me? I don't know how much more my heart can take. No mother deserves this kind of betrayal. It was classic Catherine, playing the devastated mother, carefully choosing her words to make herself sound like the victim. But what surprised me the most was the comments. Before, when she posted things like this, there would be an outpouring of support. Family members, friends, even distant acquaintances would flood her page with messages like, "You're such a good mother. She'll come back to you." Or, "She'll regret this one day." But this time, silence. A few people had left generic sending love comments, but most had ignored it completely. And a few had actually called her out. "I saw the wedding video. You weren't cut out. You were kicked out for trying to ruin it. Maybe if you didn't treat your daughter like a possession, she'd still talk to you. You made your bed, now lie in it." That was when I knew. Her hold on the family was slipping. Catherine had spent years building this perfect image of herself. The devoted mother, the misunderstood victim, the selfless woman who only wanted her family together. But now everyone had seen the truth. The wedding video had done something no amount of my words ever could. It had shown people who she really was. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Madeline, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. No messages, no calls, no dramatic texts. At first, I thought she was just giving me space, but then another relative, one of the few who had started seeing through Catherine's lies, filled me in. Madeline was struggling. She had never worked a real job before. She had never paid a bill. She had never had to take responsibility for anything. And now that Catherine was drowning in her own mess, there was no one left to shield her from reality. She had tried turning to family members, but the ones who had once supported her were suddenly hesitant. The money had dried up. The sympathy had run out. She was, for the first time in her life, just another struggling adult. Part of me wondered if she would ever reach out, if she would ever finally admit that she had benefited from my suffering all these years. But I wasn't holding my breath. Madeline wasn't the kind of person to apologize, not because she was truly cruel, but because she had never been taught how to take responsibility for anything. Catherine, on the other hand, still had one last move left. A week after the wedding, after all her social media theatrics had failed, she reached out one final time. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I don't know who else to turn to. I've been very sick lately. I don't know how much longer I have. I just want my daughter back before it's too late." It was almost laughable how predictable she was. She had done this before, back when I was younger. The "I'm sick" routine. The "I don't know how much time I have left" act. She had used it every time she needed to manipulate me into coming back. But this time, I wasn't falling for it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached out to a mutual family friend, someone who still checked in on her occasionally. I didn't explain why I was asking, just casually mentioned I had heard Catherine wasn't well. The friend laughed. Confused. "She's fine," they said. "She's been complaining nonstop about how unfair life is. But sick? No, she's perfectly fine." And that was all I needed to know. I sent one final response. "You're not sick. You're just out of people to manipulate." Then I blocked her number again. And this time, I knew. She had no moves left. No money, no allies, no power. She had finally lost.